Okay. See, I'll be in volume 2. And this is part 1, story 10, From the Dungeon to the Throne. Interesting what's happening so far. I don't really. I used to not recap, but I don't want to recap. I don't know if I want to start recapping. I have made up my mind. But let's get to the story. Part 1, story 10, From the Dungeon to the Throne. One day, as Joseph was going about his duties in the prison, a messenger came hurrying from the court. "Pharaoh wants to see you at once," he said. "Me? For what?" I can hear Joseph saying. "Come at once," repeated the messenger. How excited Joseph must have felt at that moment. As quickly as he could, he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto the Pharaoh. Shaved. What is this? Shaved himself. So, in other words, they had to be smooth and presentable. Okay, let's get back to the story. All the way from prison to the palace, he must have asked himself, what does this mean? Why has he called for me? What have I done wrong? What have I done wrong now? It never occurred to him that the chief butler may have remembered him at last, but it was exactly what had happened. Only last night the Pharaoh had a strange dream, which worried him. He felt sure it was an important meaning, but he could not think what it might be. So in the morning he had called all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof, but none of them was able to interpret the dream. It was just then that the chief butler had seen a chance to get a little glory for himself by mentioning Joseph. While the magicians and the wise men were standing around trying to think up some explanation for the Pharaoh's dream, he had the king of what he had told the king what had happened to him in the prison 2 years before, and how Joseph interpreted his dream, and the chief baker's dream had turned out exactly right. The Pharaoh became interested and anxious to have his own dream explained and sent for Joseph. Now the great door had a Now the great door into the spacious throne room opened, and Joseph was led in. Pharaoh was seated on his golden throne with gorgeously dressed officers and other servants about him. It was a marvelous sight to Joseph after all these years he had spent in a drab, dirty prison. Bowing low to the Pharaoh, he waited respectfully to find out why he had been summoned so suddenly. "I have a dream. I have dreamed a dream," said the Pharaoh, "and there is none that can interpret it. And I hear say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it." "It is not in me," said Joseph humbly. "God shall give Pharaoh the answer of peace. Then the Pharaoh told about the two dreams he had. One about the 7 lean cows that ate up the 7 fat cows, and the other about the 7 withered ears of corn eating up the 7 good ears of the good ears. Joseph understood at once. In a few words, he told the Pharaoh just what his dream meant. Both dreams, he said, had the same meaning and were sent by God to warn Pharaoh of the coming of a great famine. There would be 7 years of plenty with wonderful harvests and lots of grain and other foodstuff. That's what it says. Afterwards, there would be 7 years of the worst famine Egypt had ever seen. Now therefore, said Joseph, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him above the land of Egypt, and let him appoint officers over the land, and let him gather all the food of those good years to come, and lay up the corn under the Pharaoh's hand, and let them keep the food in the cities, and that food shall be stored in the land against the 7 years of famine. The Pharaoh was greatly impressed, not only by the interpretation of the dream, but by this sound advice from a fine young man. I'm going to finish the sentence, but it's it. And then, of course, has 2 illustrations. One at the bottom of Pharaoh dreaming, and then one at the top, Pharaoh talking to Joseph. And let me see. We start this paragraph over again. For Pharaoh was greatly impressed, not only by the interpretation of the dream, but by this sound advice from a fine young man before him. Turning to his counselors, he said, can we find such a one as this is, a man of in whom the Spirit of God is? So Joseph was chosen to rule over all the land of Egypt. Only in the throne, said the Pharaoh, will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in ventures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck, and made him to ride the second chariot which he had. And he cried before him, bow the knee. If only his brothers could have seen him now. They had sold him into as a slave, thinking it would hurt and humble him. And here he is riding through Egypt's cities in a royal chariot, with everyone bowing before him. Thus does God work for those who love and trust him, defeating the plans of their enemies and making everything come out right in the end. Should you ever find yourself in a dungeon of sorts, never fear. Be faithful, be true, for somewhere beyond is a palace and a throne, and God will lead you there. And then, of course, it has an illustration down at the bottom. And this is a tidbit that's not in this book, but it's in the Bible. They call him Zephaniah, which is Egyptian for son of God, I think. But I know it's Zephaniah. And in the movie I like to watch, and he used that name instead of, he wasn't Joseph anymore. He was Zephaniah. Alright, that is the story, story 10. And now we get ready for the other one, and we'll see you in a bit. If it'll stop.